nice to see some of the leaders in our community all singing together in the same song. Thank you for giving us a new song, or one that we know in our hearts, but you've given us more words for. Thank you very much, Jan. So Julian Burnside's blog, I've looked him up, of course. You Google everybody these days, don't you? It says, Julian Burnside, AOQC, is an Australian barrister who practices principally in commercial litigation, trade practices and administrative law. He's also a human rights and refugee advocate and author. I think for most of us here tonight, we'd actually put it in completely the reverse order. Julian Burnside is a human rights and refugee advocate, and as a sideline, he's a barrister who practices commercial litigation, trade practices, and whatever else. Thank you. And I do want to tell you the other bit I learned from Googling Julian Burnside. He's also a very significant patron of the arts, and he recently commissioned, this comes because climate change advocacy is one of the other things I care a lot about. He recently commissioned a 4-minute medley of joyous music from the great composers, which he's called Wind Farm Music, dedicated to Tony Abbott. So he's a man of many parts. So you can Google that one and find that on Facebook and play it lots and get it under Tony Abbott's nose or in his ears. Julian's going to speak on why our migration policy is as it is and what are the alternatives. Thanks, Julian.
Thanks. Having listened to Jan speak, I wanted to start by making the observation that I grew up in a Liberal voting household. I was born in the year that Robert Menzies began his record run as Prime Minister of Australia. My parents always voted Liberal and made it pretty clear that it was expected that I would vote Liberal, which I did. But then that meant something different back then. I saw a lot of Malcolm Fraser in the last 14 years for obvious reasons. Malcolm and I were on the same platform at a writers' festival about, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, and I spoke first, and I finished my comments by observing that it was my most fervent wish that the next Labor Prime Minister of Australia would be Malcolm Fraser. Of course, everyone laughed. Malcolm got up, thanked me for the compliment, and said, of course, it'll never happen. I'm much too far to the left for them. And there, in a single observation, I think, is the real problem in Australia today. The fact is that the whole political spectrum has shifted so far to the right that it's actually difficult to look around for a party that's in the centre, or what used to be the centre. When I come to a group like this, I'm reminded of a marvellous cartoon I saw. It looked like a Banksy drawing. It was on a wall, in a real place. It wasn't Banksy, but it was a full-sized drawing of a young guy in a hoodie sitting on the pavement, looking like he's begging, and this sign in front of him says, "I don't want your money, I want change." And that is what we all want in Australia today. We want change. Now, change in many respects, but tonight we're concerned about change in relation to the treatment of asylum seekers. But before I move to that, I wanted to mention one thing, because of the traditional welcome to country and all that. You know, one of the great disadvantaged groups in this country these days are Aborigines. And I recently, earlier this year, I had my very first trip to Alice Springs. I was asked by the Law Council of Northern Territory to go up there and do some things. And I asked every lawyer I met why it was that Aborigines are 14 times overrepresented in the prison system, which is the fact. There are 14 times as many Aborigines in prisons as you would expect, given their numbers in the population. Every single lawyer I spoke to said it's because of the grog. And I then asked them, well, why is it that Aborigines have a problem with grog? Not one of them had thought about it. Now, stand back and think about this. they've occupied this land for something like 40,000 years. We blew in a couple of hundred years ago and all of a sudden they've got a problem with grog. Could it be something we did? Well, that's a question for you, of course. But I think we need to think about that, because if you're concerned about social justice for anyone at all, then you really have to start wondering what the hell it is we did to the Aborigines of this country, the one group in this society who'd be entitled to say, we don't like people coming here in small boats without an invitation. They're the only people in this country who can genuinely say that. Now, if tonight is about framing the debate to win, then I would say the starting point is tell the truth. Tell the truth. It's something we need to get our politicians to do, even though they're genetically not disposed to it. We need to tell the truth, because if the public of Australia understood the detail of what we are doing, I am convinced that they would reject it out of hand, because I have a great belief in the fundamental decency of most Australians who aren't politicians. Some of the truths that you need to... these are distressing things that I've encountered with my work with asylum seekers. One man, this is mid-2000s, a man called Amin. Amin had come to Australia with his daughter, who was 8 years old at the time. At the relevant time, they were in Baxter Detention Centre. Now, Baxter, there's a story. Baxter Detention Centre was designed for and built by the Howard government. It was opened, I think, in 2004. Shortly before Baxter was opened, I'd been invited to take part in a panel session in South Australia on the refugee question. And as luck would have it, a copy of the ground plan of the soon-to-be-open Baxter Detention Centre fell off the back of a truck and drifted onto my desk. One of the other members on the panel was the Deputy Director of Immigration in charge of the Lock 'em Up Brigade, and I took the opportunity, informed by the ground plan, I took the opportunity in this public forum to ask her why it was that the perimeter fence, an electric fence, was described on the plan as a courtesy fence. Because I still don't think it's courteous to electrocute people. I wouldn't get into America. Anyway, she looked at me coldly and said, "It's not an electric fence, it's an energised fence." An 8,000 volt energised fence, which apparently in her worldview made it look better. So Amin, and of course Philip Ruddock famously announced Baxter as the family-friendly detention centre. The family-friendly detention centre with an 8,000 volt energised courtesy fence. So Amin and his daughter were in Baxter, in their high security lock-up cell, and there's a knock on the door. And they open the door and in come 5 guards. And the guards told Amin to strip because, as it turns out, they thought he had a cigarette lighter. Now, a person in Australia who's not committed any offence should not have a cigarette lighter, of course. Anyway, Amin refused, not only because it's culturally appalling for a person to be naked in front of another person, but his 8-year-old daughter was in the room. So he refused. So they roughed him up, handcuffed him and dragged him off to the management unit. The management unit at Baxter was 13 solitary confinement cells, each measuring 2.5 metres square, with no furnishings except a mattress on the floor. The occupant of the cell is not allowed anything to read, anything to write with. They're not allowed any music, no DVDs, no CDs, no radio, nothing. No company and no privacy either, because they are video monitored 24 hours a day, and for the purpose of the video monitoring, the lights are left on 24 hours a day. And this is done at the pure administrative discretion of the Immigration Department people who run the centre. So Amin is put into solitary confinement, and his only relief is that for 20 minutes in each 24 hours he's allowed a visit from his daughter. But after he'd been in solitary for a couple of weeks, his daughter missed a visit, and he was very upset. So he complained to the person who was in charge of the department, of the detention centre for the department, and this guy explained to him that his daughter had been taken into Port Augusta shopping, and she'd be there the next day. The next day came and went. She didn't visit. At the end of the day, the same man came in and told Amin that his daughter was now back in Tehran. And if he wanted to see her again, he should abandon his claim for protection and return to Iran voluntarily. At first he thought they were joking. When he was persuaded it was true, he had a complete nervous collapse and spent the next 8 weeks in solitary confinement until even the psychiatrist employed by the Department of Immigration said, "You must let him out of solitary, it is destroying him." We learned about it in Melbourne and went to the federal court on an application to have him returned into the general part of the detention centre. We weren't being so adventurous as to ask that he be released, just removed from solitary confinement because it was destroying him. And the department's initial argument was, you, the judge, are not entitled to tell us how to treat people in immigration detention. That was the argument put forward by the immigration department of this country. Luckily, the court saw it differently and Amin was removed. Not only removed from the solitary confinement cells at Baxter, but the judge ordered that he be removed to a different detention centre so he wouldn't have to face the people who had mistreated him so grossly. Let me tell you just one thing briefly about the effects of detention on people. Our indefinite detention system destroys people. We know it destroys people. The psychiatrists tell us how it destroys people. We've got lots and lots of case studies of how it destroys people. And you will have seen on the slide that Jan showed, the average time in detention in European countries and America is in the order of 8, 10, 12 days. In Australia, the average time in detention, 241 days. And of course, we've got children who've been in detention for much more than a year. You may remember in the East of 2002, there was a disturbance outside the Woomera Detention Centre. A lot of Australians were protesting about the fact of immigration detention and so on. And they managed to prise apart a couple of the palisade bars of that great glittering structure at Woomera, and a number of people inside slipped out through the opening in the bars, and a few of them escaped. They were surrounded by a phalanx of federal police, so most of them weren't able to escape, but some of them made a run for it. And when they were later picked up, because it's an awfully long way from anywhere, and there's only so far you can go in the desert sun, when they were later picked up, they were charged with escaping from immigration detention. And there was a series of prosecutions in the Magistrates Court in Adelaide for these people who'd escaped from immigration detention, and I was asked to go over there and look after some of them. In preparation for that, I went to the Government Gazette, by which the Immigration Detention Centre at Woomera was gazetted. And it turns out that it's an enormous area, hundreds and hundreds of square kilometres, and the palisade thing that you see, that's just a little sort of square in the centre. These people have never actually got away from immigration detention. So I thought that was quite a good defence. And so I would go to the cells and explain to people what was going on and this and that. And I went to see one guy, a young Hazara man, and I introduced myself and explained that I was there to act for him pro bono and to defend the case, and this is how it was going to play out. And after a couple of minutes, I realised that there was a bit of a communication problem. And I didn't know what it was, but I assumed it was about language. So I asked him, "What's my name?" And he told me my name. And I said, "And what's your name?" And he told me his name. I said, "What's your mother's name?" And he stared into the distance, that 1,000-yard stare that prisoners get. And he said, "I can't remember." And I said, "What are your brothers and sisters' names?" And he stared off into the distance and said, "I can't remember." I asked him more questions. It was clear that the language wasn't a problem. I asked him more questions, and it turned out his entire past had disappeared. It had been blasted away because of 5 years in immigration detention. I don't think I've ever met a person who was quite so shattered as that man, although Kate and I were very distressed a couple of years before this. the Tampa rescued the people who'd sought safety on a little boat called the Palapa, 438 Afghan Hazaras on the Palapa. And of course it was that episode which led to the great Tampa case in the federal court, and during the Tampa case in the federal court, the Howard government introduced the idea of the Pacific solution. They rang around the Pacific and bribed Nauru to take people we didn't want. And on the 25th of August 2002, just one day short of the 1 year anniversary, all the people from the Tampa who'd got to Nauru, the ones who hadn't been taken by New Zealand, they were organising a bit of a commemoration to commemorate the fact that it was 1 year since the master of the Tampa had rescued them from the Indian Ocean. And that was all going to happen on the 26th of August 2002. And on the morning of the 26th of August 2002, a young Hazara man, Mohammed Sawar, who from the photograph that we have looks like he's about 15, but we understand he was maybe 21, 22, he apparently woke up, sat up in bed, cried out, and fell back dead. The government of Nauru refused to hold an autopsy to see why he died. His friends who wrote to us were quite clear about it. They said his heart broke and he went to seek asylum that only God can give. The government of Australia refused to repatriate his body to Afghanistan because they said it was too dangerous to send a corpse back to Afghanistan. At the same time, they were sending living Hazaras back to Afghanistan because it was safe enough for them. These are things that I find impossible to reconcile with my understanding of what Australians are like. Jan referred to the New York Times. The New York Times editorial yesterday, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, refers to our policy of treatment of asylum seekers as inhumane and as of dubious legality. They refer to Nauru as a purgatory where children are sexually abused and the perpetrators are never prosecuted. They refer to the whole treatment of asylum seekers by Australia as unconscionable. This is the world opinion of what we are doing, and yet in the little bubble created by the Murdoch press and the Abbott government, we're told this is world's best practice. You may recall that in the wake of the drowning of 700 people off Lampedusa earlier this year, Pope Francis, bless him, and I parted company with religion decades ago, but I think Pope Francis is terrific. Pope Francis gave his really powerful speech about the globalisation of indifference, and the Abbott government started saying, well, that's the sort of thing that happens if you don't have strong border control. He started urging European governments to follow Australia's lead. I'm glad to say that even UKIP, even Nigel Farage of UKIP, reckons that they wouldn't have a bar of the way we deal with asylum seekers. Only one person that I'm aware of spoke in favour of it, and that was a columnist in the Murdoch press called Katie Hopkins. Katie Hopkins praised Australia. She said we had, balls of steel and tiny hearts. And she praised us for our strong, quote-unquote, border control policies. The compliment was slightly diminished by the fact that she referred to refugees as vermin and cockroaches. That is the cohort overseas who regard with favour what we are doing. People who would have felt comfortably at home in the Nazi regime in the 1930s are prepared to speak like that about us. And frankly, I think that in future years, if we're lucky, in future years, people will look back and see us with the same sort of disfavour as we all see. We have to, if we're going to frame the debate to win, we have to counteract all the lies. The lie that it's illegal. Read the sign. Let me tell you, here's some legal advice for free. It's correct. We talk about border security. What bullshit. Really, border security? Refugees aren't a threat. Security is only a relevant consideration if you're dealing with a threat. Refugees are not a threat to Australia. It's been said often enough by ASIO that to their knowledge, no terrorist has ever come to Australia as a boat person, and no terrorist ever would, because they can get dodgy papers and a business class airfare. Why would they risk their lives coming as boat people? We've heard it referred to as border control, another misleading bit of rhetoric. Most people don't recognise that the number of people who come into Australia each year, most of them for very short-term purposes, the numbers work out this way: about 150 or 200,000 new permanent migrants. Not people fleeing persecution, just people moving on. We take them because they've got skills that we want. About 4 to 5 million tourists, 4 to 5 million people come across our borders every year, mostly for short-term purposes like business or tourism. And what's our largest number ever in the last 30 years, 40 years of boat people coming without permission? 25,000. That worst year, 2012, the year which was written up as catastrophic for us, that represented a failure of border control in 0.5% of cases. Now, at school, I always thought 99.5% was a good mark. But apparently it's a failure of border control. Anyway, the border control thing is ludicrous. Border security is ludicrous. And then they've got the drownings argument. The drownings argument is another lie on which they make themselves feel as profoundly Christian as they tell us they are. They're terribly distressed about the idea that people might drown in their attempt to seek safety in Australia. Well, of course, it's awful when people drown. And the photograph of the little Syrian boy who had drowned and was lying face down on the beach, it was deeply distressing. Of course it is. But no more distressing than if that same child had stayed in Syria and been blown to bits by the Assad regime. No more distressing than the Hazaras who don't flee and get killed by the Taliban, the Hazara children who were used after the Taliban were removed, who were used as living minesweepers. No more distressing than the people who were shot dead in the streets of whatever troubled country they're coming from. The real point being made by the Abbott government was, we don't want to know that they're dead. We don't want to see their deaths. We don't want to be disturbed by the discomfort which causes them to flee. We know, of course, that in all refugee movement, people die. That is the fact of it, and it's awful. But if they don't flee, some of them will also die. That's the fact of it. And it's a fact which we need to understand and which Tony Abbott needs to understand. If only he were a sentient being, he might just gradually get the point. And if you need to be persuaded that the drownings excuse is false, consider the logic that because we're worried about people drowning, we punish them if they don't. You know? The September 2013 election campaign was all about how tough both major parties would be on refugees who come here as boat people. We promised to mistreat them so that they won't even try to come. The truth of the fact is the government thinks that they don't want any refugees coming here at all in any circumstances except on their say-so. Now, refugee movement has never been quite as tidy as that. So, what do we do with them? Well, we treat them with deliberate cruelty so they won't come, to punish them for not drowning. I had a meeting in my chambers a month or two ago. 5 former workers from Manus Island and a senior Labor parliamentarian who I thought was well disposed towards refugees in a general sense. And one of the former Manus workers was a doctor who was not a bleeding heart like me, a doctor who spent his entire professional life working in the prison system in Australia, but who thought a year on Manus would be good because the pay was good. So he went there and he said 3 things that really struck me. First, he said, when he initially got to Manus and saw the compound in which the men were kept, he immediately thought, this is what Auschwitz must have been like. Second, after a couple of months working there, he formed the view that the conditions in which they're kept and the way in which they're treated is 100 times worse than anything he has seen in the Australian prison system. Okay? We treat innocent human beings much worse than we treat convicted criminals. And third, by the end of the year, he was convinced that barely below the surface, the purpose of the conditions and the treatment in Manus is to break the spirit of people who are there so that they will abandon their claim for protection and return to face persecution. And it calls to mind the sentiment which Kate and I have both heard a number of times over the years from various asylum seekers, to the effect that in my country they kill you quickly, in Australia they kill you slowly. That is the way we are seen even by the asylum seekers. Now, the other place of offshore processing, so-called offshore processing, it's not offshore processing. We're simply forcibly pushing people onto another country with the promise they will never be settled in Australia. Even though they turn out to be refugees, they will never be settled here. We send them off to Nauru, and I'm pretty sure that Sam is going to tell you about the realities of life on Nauru for detainees. But one point: people held in detention on Nauru in misery and distress are given requisition forms by Transfield Services. Transfield Services, an Australian company which takes Australian taxpayers' money in return for tormenting asylum seekers in the detention system offshore. If you've got shares in Transfield, dump them. Rebuy a few shares in tobacco, you know. Transfield hand out requisition forms so that detainees can say, please, I need a bar of soap, or please, I need some sanitary napkins, or please, I need some toothpaste. And they hand those in to the Wilson Security Guards. Wilson Security, another Australian company. Wilson Security Guards at the entrance to each of the compounds can receive the requisition forms filled out by innocent human beings who need some soap or whatever it may be. And the Wilson Security Guard told me that this is regarded as a standing joke, because at the end of each day they throw out the requisition forms they've been given. These people are being treated, not only are they not being treated kindly, not only are they not being treated with compassion, they're being treated with contempt. That is Australia's face to the world. If you come asking for our help, we will treat you with contempt and cruelty. And how does all of this survive? Well, it survives in part because of the lies. We've been told they're illegal, it's border control, border security, and so the sense has built up in Australia over the last 15 years that we're being protected from dangerous criminals. It's a lie. And one of the reasons that children, and Gillian Trigg's report, one of the reasons that children in detention are such a problem for the government is that it's kind of difficult to see a 5-year-old holding onto the wire and think that she's a dangerous criminal that we need to be protected from. That's just a hard thing to accept. Okay, so all the secrecy, the Border Force Act. The Border Force Act, which was recently passed, makes it a criminal offence for anyone working in the detention system to reveal anything that they learn during their work within the detention system. So that, for example, in theory, a person who reports a case of child sex abuse in detention can be jailed for 2 years for reporting it. Outside the detention system, it's a criminal offence not to report it. Inside the detention system, it's a criminal offence to report it. And as someone said on Twitter not long ago, when it becomes a crime to report a crime, you are being governed by criminals. And I frankly think that's right. The cost of this criminality... Sorry. No, okay. Okay, I'll race through this. The cost of this is spectacular. Everyone knows it, it's around about $5 billion a year. No one knows what $5 billion means because it's a number that only Gina Reinhardt understands. But I've got a new measure. It's $5 billion a year for the detention system onshore and offshore. That is 1 million Geelong chopper rides every year. Everyone understands that. And there's a way of framing the debate. Tell everyone it's 1 million chopper rides a year. We have some alternatives. Three alternatives, just very quickly, if I'm allowed. Okay, thank you. First, and I'll repeat something that I think I might have first said in this hall a few years ago. If the government is so obsessed about maintaining the system of indefinite detention, declare the whole island of Tasmania a place of detention, then refugees can live in the community. And instead of spending 1 million Geelong chopper rides a year on Wilson and Transfield, we can give just, say, $1,000 million a year to the government of Tasmania for their trouble. That'd be quite good all round. Second possibility, we could, of course, if we're actually worried about drownings, if the government was genuine about that, well then here's the thing. The UNHCR has a global annual budget of a bit over 3 billion Australian dollars a year for their entire global work. Okay, so let's offer them $1 billion a year, and we would want them to use that specifically for processing asylum claims in Malaysia and Indonesia of people who would otherwise be wanting to get on a boat. And promise them that if they are assessed as a refugee, they will be safely, swiftly resettled in Australia, in New Zealand, in America, Canada, every other country we can rope into this, and tell them, in the meantime, whilst you're waiting for swift, safe resettlement, do not use a people smuggler. You would stop the illegal boat people smuggling trade dead, straight away. And it just occurs to me, you might like to ask your federal representatives like Erica Betts, why is it that we are prepared to spend $5 billion a year mistreating people instead of $1 billion a year having them processed properly and avoiding the drownings? If the drownings is their thing, here's a way around that problem. He may not have an answer. The third possibility is this. Let's assume that we've been so unpleasant to Malaysia and Indonesia, they wouldn't go along with that. So let's assume that people will still continue to risk their lives to escape persecution. Let's assume that people will continue to arrive in Australia as boat people. Stop offshore processing. Accept the fact that boat people will come here because desperate people will do desperate things to reach safety. Initially, put them in detention. I don't have a problem with that. I'm not into open borders. But the detention would be limited to 1 month. At the end of 1 month, they're released into the community on a visa with 4 principal conditions. 1, they must stay in touch with the department. 2, they're allowed to work. 3, they're allowed full access to Medicare and Centrelink benefits. 4, until their refugee status is decided, they must live in a regional or rural town or city, not in the coastal capitals. Now, in order to see how that plays out, you need to make some assumptions. How many people will come and how many people will get jobs? Okay, let's take the 2012 figure, 25,000 people. It was right off the charts, but let's assume that becomes the new normal. It's the most pessimistic assumption possible. And let's assume every single one of them stays on full Centrelink benefits for the entire time. It's against all experience, but let's just pretend. What would that cost? It would cost $500 million a year in Centrelink payments. But of course all of that would be spent in the failing economy of regional towns and cities, on accommodation, food, clothing and so on, and everyone on Centrelink knows that there's not much left over once you've looked after accommodation, food and clothing. And so at $500 million a year we could actually do some good for refugees, we could do some good for the regional economies, and we would stop wasting another $4.5 billion a year mistreating people, causing long-term harm. Now, you know, that seems to me to be better. So, as I said this afternoon, for a 90% discount, we could actually do some good. Two final points. Erica Betts. I've been encouraging people to write to parliamentarians asking brief, simple questions to tease out what they think about refugee treatment. One lady wrote to me and she sent in the responses she'd received. The letters that she wrote to 45 different senators said, "Dear Senator X, do you think we treat asylum seekers humanely? ? Do you think they are illegal? ? Yours faithfully." It's a perfect form of letter. Only 9 people of the 45 she wrote to bothered to answer her letter. 8 of the 9 sent back 2-page press releases which didn't deal with the questions. One of them, only one of them, did answer the questions, and that was Erica Betts. His answers were, yes, we treat them humanely, and yes, they're illegal. So, you know, you win some, you lose some. He's, well, bad luck, Tasmania. What can you do in the meantime? As long as we have got people like Tony Abbott and Erica Betts and Peter Dutton running the system, it will not change. What can we do? As I came in this evening, I was given this leaflet from the Refugee Legal Service. They're trying to raise money because what they need to do is to employ a migration agent to help the current group of Tasmanian asylum seekers with their temporary protection visa applications. This becomes very important because the Commonwealth Government withdrew its funding from various organisations that were helping asylum seekers lodge their claims for protection. These are people who've got limited grasp of English and who are given a very short time in which to persuade the government that they should not be returned to the country they've fled from. And organisations like the Refugee Legal Service provide a really, really vital service to make sure that Australia lives up to its obligations under the Refugees Convention. So if you want to do something constructive today, consider making a donation to this mob. And can I make one disclaimer? I never accept payment for any refugee-related work, so I have no personal interest in this, but it's a really, really good thing to do. Thank you very much.